The iron shackles had gnawed Jane's wrists to raw bone blood threading down her fingers like the tears she refused to shed. Standing on the makeshift auction block in Hutchins' filthy barn, her swollen belly straining against her only dress, she could taste copper and shame in equal measure. The gathered men spoke in hushed tones, their eyes calculating her worth like they would a brood mare. Mama's hands shaking as she counted the coins not meeting Jane's eyes. "You brought this on yourself, girl. Least you can do is make it worth something." The same hands that had once braided her hair, now trading her flesh for winter meat and whiskey money. "She's got good birthing hips," wheezed Garrett the blacksmith, his tobacco-stained beard glistening with spit. "Babies do any day, but hell, that just proves she's fertile." "Question is what kind of work you're buying her for," laughed Pike Morrison, crude and leering. "Some work requires more cooperation than others." Jane's stomach lurched, but not from the child pressing against her ribs. The memory of her mother's betrayal cut deeper than any chain the woman who had once sung lullabies over her fevered bed, now singing her praises to strange men with strange hungers. "We'll start the bidding at $5, called Hutchins, his voice echoing off rotting beams. "Girl's got fire, they tell me. Knows how to work hard, keep her mouth shut when it matters." Jane bit her tongue until she tasted blood, feeling for the thin blade, hidden in her boot, a gift from a dying drifter, who'd whispered that sometimes salvation came sharp and desperate. She would not weep. Not here. Not for them. Her child would never know this helplessness, this reduction to flesh and function. The shadows shifted, and a tall figure emerged from the barn's depths. His face was carved from weathered leather, scarred by wind, and something deeper loss, maybe, or the kind of pain that carved its name into a man's bones. He wore no hat, his graying hair wild as prairie grass, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of empty houses and unmarked graves. $25? Silence fell like a physical thing. Even the horses in the stalls seemed to hold their breath. That's more than fair," Hutchins stammered, clearly not expecting such a generous offer so quickly. $50. The stranger continued his eyes, never leaving Jane's face. She saw something there, not desire, not ownership, but recognition. The look of one wounded animal acknowledging another. "Sold." Hutchins banged his gavel before anyone could object, probably fearing the stranger might change his mind. "Owen Pike, you just bought yourself a wife." As coins changed hands, Jane felt the weight of her mother's gaze. When she finally looked at Mrs. Morley, she saw not triumph or relief, but something harder to name, regret perhaps, or the terrible satisfaction of a difficult decision made final. "You remember what I taught you about keeping a man satisfied?" her mother said, approaching with the key to Jane's shackles. "You remember, and maybe you'll make something decent of yourself yet." Jane said nothing as the iron fell away, but her hand found the knife in her boot. Some lessons she decided were meant to be forgotten. Owen Pike's ranch crouched on the West Texas Badlands, like a scar that refused to heal 40 miles from the nearest neighbor and 100 miles from anything resembling civilization. The house, once painted white and proud, now sagged under layers of dust and neglect. Shutters hung at angles that spoke of storms weathered alone, and the porch steps groaned under Owen's boots as he carried Jane across the threshold. "Upstairs room gets morning light," he said, setting her down gently when her legs proved steady enough. "Figured that might be better for the baby." Jane surveyed the main room with a survivor's eye for detail. Clean but sparse. Hand-carved furniture that spoke of long, lonely evenings. On the mantel, 7 small wooden crosses caught the lamplight, each one carved with infinite care, each one a story she wasn't ready to hear. "Your children?" she asked. Owen's jaw tightened like a man bracing for physical blow. "Were." He vanished into the kitchen, leaving Jane to navigate the narrow stairs alone. The room he'd given her was small, but swept clean with a quilt on the bed that had been stitched by loving hands, a woman's work precise and beautiful. A rocking chair sat by the window, positioned to catch the first rays of dawn. That first week, they danced around each other like wary animals. Owen left food outside her door, fresh bread still warm from the oven venison stew that filled the house with rich aromas, milk that carried the sweet taste of careful tending. He worked from dawn to dusk, mending fence posts with methodical precision, talking to his cattle in low, gentle tones that carried across the prairie like prayers. Jane watched him from her window, studying the set of his shoulders when he thought no one was looking, and the way he paused sometimes to stare at the horizon as if expecting ghosts to emerge from the heat shimmer. When he thought she was sleeping, she heard him on the porch at night, his boots marking time against the wooden boards, a lonely rhythm that spoke of old grief and older guilt. On the fourth morning, she found him in the kitchen before dawn, coffee steaming in the blue-black darkness. "Why?" she asked without preamble. He didn't pretend to misunderstand. "Been asking myself the same question." "And what answer did you find?" Owen poured coffee into a second cup, pushed it across the scarred table. "Maybe a man gets tired of being the only living thing on his land." Jane wrapped her fingers around the cup, feeling warmth seep through cracked ceramic. "Maybe a woman gets tired of being treated like something to be bought and sold." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun painted the eastern sky the color of fresh blood. Two damaged souls learning the tentative steps of trust. Neither mentioned how Jane's hands shook when she held the cup, or how Owen's eyes lingered on those 7 crosses with something approaching worship. Neither spoke of Jane's habit of flinching when he moved too quickly, or the way she sometimes stared at nothing with haunted eyes. But storms in West Texas never stayed on the horizon long. Martha Briggs arrived on a Tuesday morning when the December air carried the bite of winter and the promise of worse to come. She rode side saddle on a bay mare, her black dress severe against the bleached landscape, her spine straight as a fence post, and twice as unforgiving. Jane watched from the kitchen window as Owen emerged from the barn, his face already closing like a house being shuttered against hurricane winds. Owen Pike. Martha's voice carried the authority of a woman who'd appointed herself judge, jury, and executioner of the county's moral failings. "We need words, Mrs. Briggs." Owen's greeting held all the warmth of January stone. "Don't you dare Mrs. Briggs me, you fool man. Tomorrow's fire day, and the whole county will be talking about nothing but what you've done, bringing that creature into decent folks' sight." Jane's hand drifted to her boot fingers, brushing the hidden blade. Fire Day, the annual remembrance of the great blazes that had swept through the county over the years, taking lives and property in their wake. A day when old wounds reopened and old accusations resurfaced. What I do on my land concerns no one but me. Concerns everyone when you parade sin like it was something holy. Martha's voice pitched higher, designed to carry. "That girl's nothing but a whore with a bastard in her belly, and you supposedly a God-fearing man harboring filth under your roof like it was blessed." Jane watched Owen's hands clench at his sides, saw the muscle in his jaw jump like a trapped animal. Something deep in her chest tightened, not fear for herself, but fear for him. Fear of what Martha's poison might cost the only man who'd ever shown her kindness. "Careful, Martha. Your Christian charity's showing." "Christian charity." Martha laughed, sharp and bitter as winter wind. "I showed Christian charity when I warned my dear sister about you. Told her you'd bring nothing but death and misery. And I was right, wasn't I? Sarah's dead, and so are all her babies because she trusted Owen Pike." The words hit Owen like physical blows. Jane saw his shoulders bow under the weight of old accusations, old guilt settling on him like a lead blanket. The sight awakened something protective and fierce in her chest, a feeling she'd thought died years ago, buried with other dangerous emotions. Tommy's face disappearing under the black water, his hand slipping from hers despite her frantic grip. "Jane, Jane, help me." But she'd been too small, too weak, and the current had taken him anyway. Jane shoved the memory away, focusing on the present threat. "That's enough." Martha's attention snapped to the window, where Jane stood, her eyes glittering with malicious satisfaction. "Ah, the whore speaks. How convenient. You don't know anything about what happened to Owen's family. Jane called through the glass. And you don't know anything about me. Don't I? I know you were sold like livestock at Hutchins' barn. I know you spread your legs for any man with coin enough to buy you. And I know that baby in your belly is proof of your shame. Jane's hands trembled with rage, not shame. She'd felt enough shame to last several lifetimes, shame for being hungry, for being beaten, for surviving when others didn't. But she was done apologizing for existing. I'll tell you what's going to happen. Martha continued, her voice carrying across the yard with the weight of prophecy. Tomorrow, when decent folks gather for Fire Day remembrance, they're going to hear the truth about this arrangement. About what kind of man buys women at auction and what kind of woman sells herself to the highest bidder. She wheeled her horse toward the road, but called back over her shoulder. Think on it, Owen. Think on what's coming for you and your purchased bride. Fire Day has a way of burning away pretense. As Martha's figure dwindled against the horizon, Jane saw Owen sink onto the porch steps, his head in his hands. She remained at the window long after he'd gone back to his work. One hand on her swollen belly, the other touching the knife that might be her only defense against whatever storm Martha Briggs was brewing. That night, she listened to Owen pace the porch until dawn, his footsteps marking time like a heartbeat in the darkness, steady, determined, alive. The sound should have been comforting, but Jane heard something else in it, the rhythm of a man preparing for war. The blizzard struck 3 days later without warning, turning the December sky black as midnight at 2 in the afternoon. Jane had been hanging laundry when the first snowflakes began falling, fat and lazy, followed quickly by wind that howled like something wounded and dying. Owen was in the south pasture, checking on cattle that had huddled together against the storm. Jane paced the kitchen, her belly tight with contractions that came and went like unwelcome visitors. Not true labor yet, but getting closer. Each time Martha's threats echoed in her mind, her panic grew. Decent folks are going to handle this situation. When the contractions began coming every 20 minutes, Jane made a decision born of desperation and terror. She couldn't let them take her baby. Couldn't let Owen suffer for the kindness he'd shown. If she disappeared into the storm, if she made herself the problem's solution, maybe the good man who'd saved her could find peace. The memory of Tommy's death flashed through her mind. Another person she'd failed to save, another life, lost because she wasn't strong enough or fast enough or good enough. But this time would be different. This time her sacrifice might actually mean something. She bundled herself in Owen's heavy coat, wrapped her head in wool, and stepped into the blizzard. The cold hit her like a physical wall, stealing her breath and filling her lungs with ice. Snow stung her eyes, filled her mouth and nose with crystal needles. Within minutes, she couldn't see the house behind her or any path ahead. The wind stripped away her strength, her thoughts, everything but the animal need to keep moving forward. A contraction seized her stronger this time, dropping her to hands and knees in snow that reached her elbows. She crawled forward, following what she hoped was the fence line toward town. But the landmarks she'd memorized were erased by the storm's fury. This is how Tommy felt, she thought, as the cold began to numb her extremities. This helplessness, this terror of dying alone. Her water broke in a rush of warmth that turned instantly to ice against her legs. Jane collapsed against a fence post, her strength gone, her body convulsing with labor and cold in equal measure. Please, she whispered to the howling wind, please don't let her be born out here. Don't let her die because of my cowardice. Through the snow she heard Owen calling her name, distant at first, then closer, desperate and raw. Jane, Jane, where are you? Answer me. She tried to call back, but the wind stole her voice. Then strong arms were lifting her, and Owen's face appeared above her, like salvation snow clinging to his beard, his eyes wild with fear, and something deeper, love maybe, or its desperate beginning. Why? He asked, carrying her back toward the house, his boots churning through drifts that reached his knees. Christ, Jane, why would you run into this? They'll take her. Jane gasped between contractions. Martha. She'll find a way to take my baby. No. Owen's voice was steel wrapped in velvet. No one takes anything from us, not anymore. He carried her into the house, up the stairs, laid her gently on the bed that had once belonged to his dead wife. As he built up the fire and gathered blankets, Jane watched his face, saw something there she'd never seen before. Not just kindness, but fierce protectiveness. Don't let their hate steal what we're building here, he said, kneeling beside the bed, taking her frost-bitten hands in his. Don't let them make you run from the first real home either of us has ever known. Jane squeezed his hands, feeling warmth return to her fingers, along with something else, hope, fragile as new ice, but real as the child moving in her womb. The storm raged outside, but inside something new was taking root. Not just trust, but the dangerous beginning of love. The raids began exactly 1 week after the blizzard passed, as if Martha Briggs had been waiting for the weather to clear before unleashing her particular brand of righteous fury. They came the night before, Fire Day drunk townsmen with torches and moral certainty, their faces painted orange by firelight, their voices raised in hymns that sounded more like war chants. Owen met them at the property line with a rifle, and cold resolve never firing, but making it abundantly clear he would if pressed. You can't hide behind that Winchester forever, Pike, shouted Hutchins, the same man who'd conducted Jane's auction, his voice thick with whiskey and regret. Lord knows I wish I'd never. But what's done is done, and decent Christians won't stand for this abomination much longer. Then maybe you should go find some decent Christians to speak for. Owen called back his voice, carrying across the frozen ground like Judgment Day. All I see here are drunks and cowards hiding behind scripture they never bothered to read. That girl's a whore, screamed someone from the back of the group. And you're harboring sin under your roof like it was something holy. Morot, what I'm harboring. Owen replied, never lowering his rifle, is a pregnant woman who needs shelter. If that offends your Christian sensibilities, maybe you need to examine what kind of Christians you really are. After they left cursing and stumbling in the darkness, Owen came inside to find Jane sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale, but determined, a carving knife within easy reach. Tell me about them, she said without preamble. The children you lost. Owen hesitated, then pulled out the chair across from her. For a long moment, he stared at his hands, scarred from honest work, weathered by grief that had no end. Sarah was already carrying when we married. He began, his voice rough as sandpaper. Twins. They came too early, lived 3 days. Sarah blamed herself, said she must have done something wrong, but Doc Henderson said sometimes babies just aren't meant for this world. Jane reached across the table, covered his hands with hers. The touch sent unexpected warmth through her chest, tinged with guilt she didn't understand. The others came over the years. 2 more stillborn, one took fever at 6 months, another fell into the creek when he was learning to walk. Owen's voice cracked slightly. Each time Sarah died a little more. Started saying God was punishing us for something that maybe we weren't meant to be parents. Like God punished me for letting Tommy drown. Jane thought, but kept the words locked behind her teeth. And the fire. Took Sarah and the last baby together. Started in the barn while I was in town buying winter supplies. Came home to smoke and screaming, and nothing I could do but watch it burn. He looked up at Jane, his eyes reflecting pain that had no bottom. Martha blames me because I wasn't here. Says if I'd been the husband Sarah deserved, they'd all still be alive. Jane squeezed his hands, fighting the urge to confess her own guilt. Grief makes people cruel. Doesn't make them right. Over the following days, they fell into routines born of necessity and growing affection. Owen taught Jane to shoot his hand steady on hers as she learned to sight down the rifle barrel. Jane cooked meals that filled the house with warmth and purpose, her presence chasing away echoes that had haunted the empty rooms for too long. But Martha Briggs wasn't finished with them. Not by half. She returned on Fire Day afternoon. But this time she brought official company Deputy Marshal Tom Crawford, a man with a badge and a drinking problem, carrying a legal document that made Jane's blood run cold. Behind them rode 6 men with the look of hired guns, their leader a lean man with cold eyes and silver spurs. Name's Jericho Kane, the leader said, touching his hat brim in mock courtesy. Mrs. Briggs here's engaged my services to ensure this legal matter gets resolved expeditiously. It's all legal and proper, Martha announced, standing in their kitchen like a conquering general. Petition signed by 15 upstanding citizens declaring Owen Pike mentally unfit to care for a woman in her condition. Courts ordered that said woman be placed in protective custody until such time as her child can be born in a Christian environment. This is my home, Jane said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. This is a house of sin and madness, Martha replied. That baby deserves better than to be raised by a broken man and his purchased whore. Crawford, clearly uncomfortable but determined to do his duty, cleared his throat. Ma'am, you need to come with us. Just until after the baby's born. Then we can sort out proper arrangements for everyone involved. Jane's hand found the knife at her belt. She'd taken to wearing it openly since the raids began. I'm not going anywhere with you. Kane's smile was sharp as a blade. Now that's where you're wrong, darling. See, Mrs. Briggs is paying me good money to ensure this situation gets resolved without complications. And I always deliver what I'm paid for. Jane. Owen's voice carried a warning. She could see him calculating odds, measuring distances, weighing the cost of violence against the price of surrender. You have no legal right to take her, Owen said to Crawford. She's not committed any crime, and she's not my ward. She's a free woman who can make her own choices. Free woman? Martha laughed bitterly. She was sold at auction like livestock. What kind of freedom is that? The kind that lets her choose where to go from here, Jane replied, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. And I choose to stay. Crawford shifted uncomfortably, his hand resting on his pistol grip. Look, folks, I don't want any trouble. But the law's the law, and this petition's been signed by half the county. Mrs. McAllister needs proper care during her confinement, and Mr. Pike, well, the court has concerns about his mental state. What concerns? Owen's voice had gone dangerously quiet. 7 dead children, Mr. Pike. A dead wife. Isolation, strange behavior, and now this. Arrangement with a woman young enough to be your daughter. Crawford's voice grew more confident as he recited what were clearly Martha's own words. Pattern suggests a man who's lost his grip on reality, possibly dangerous to himself and others. Jane felt the baby kick hard against her ribs, as if responding to her spike of anger. But beneath the anger, guilt writhed like a living thing. 7 dead children. If Owen knew about Tommy, would he see her the same way as someone who brought death to the innocent? The only person who's dangerous here, Jane said, pushing the guilt aside, is the woman who spent 3 years poisoning this county against a good man because she can't face her own grief. Martha's face went white, then red. You don't know anything about grief, you little whore. You don't know what it's like to lose. I know what it's like to be sold by my own mother for whiskey money. Jane cut her off. I know what it's like to be hungry, to be beaten, to be told every day that I'm worthless. And I know what it's like to find someone who treats me like I matter. So don't you dare lecture me about loss. And I know what it's like to watch someone die because you weren't strong enough to save them, she added silently, the memory of Tommy's terrified face rising unbidden. The kitchen fell silent, except for the tick of the clock on the mantel and the whistle of wind through the gaps in the windows. Kane stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. "Touching speech, ma'am, but sentiment don't change the law. You're coming with us one way or another." Owen's rifle came up fast, pointing directly at Kane's chest. "Get out, now!" Kane didn't flinch. His smile widened, revealing teeth like yellow pearls. "Now, Mr. Pike, that's not very neighborly. Lot of men outside and they're all feeling motivated today. Question is, how many folks you willing to see die over one pregnant whore?" "As many as it takes," Owen replied without hesitation. The standoff stretched tight as a wire 5 armed people facing off while the afternoon light faded toward evening. Then from the southwestern horizon came a sound that made everyone's blood run cold, the distant roar of flames driven by wind. Jane discovered the truth by accident, digging through Owen's papers while he stood guard on the porch, and Kane's men waited in the yard like patient vultures. She'd been looking for anything that might help the deed to the property correspondence with lawyers, anything that might give them legal leverage against Martha's petition. Instead, she found the packet of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon hidden in the bottom drawer of Owen's desk. They were love letters written in Sarah's careful hand, but they weren't all addressed to Owen. Half were meant for someone else, someone Sarah called "My dearest James," someone she promised to run away with as soon as she could manage it. Jane's hands shook as she read the final letter dated just 2 days before the fire. "My darling James, I cannot bear this pretense any longer. Owen is a good man, but he is not the man I love. And this baby, our baby, deserves to know his real father. When our son comes, we will take him and start fresh in California just as we planned. I have told Martha of our intentions, and though she disapproves, she understands that love cannot be forced. The money from the sale of my jewelry will be enough to get us started, and your job with the railroad will provide security. Soon we will be free of this desolate place, free to love, as God intended." But there was more. At the bottom of the packet, Jane found a letter in a different hand, masculine, decisive, dated 3 days after the fire. "Owen, I know you must hate me for what Sarah and I planned, but I want you to know the fire wasn't your fault. I was supposed to meet her that night, help her and the baby get away. But my horse threw a shoe 20 miles out, and I had to walk back to town. By the time I got word of the fire, it was too late. Sarah died calling my name, not yours, and I've carried that guilt every day since. I'm heading to Mexico to start over, but I wanted you to know the truth. The baby she carried was mine, conceived in love, and died in tragedy. Maybe someday you can forgive us both. James Whitmore." Jane stared at the letters, her mind reeling. But something felt wrong about the handwriting, about the tone. She'd learned to read people's true intentions through years of survival, and this letter rang false. At the very bottom of the drawer, wrapped in oilcloth, she found a newspaper clipping from the Fort Worth Daily Democrat, dated 6 months before the fire. "Railroad foreman, killed in avalanche. James Whitmore, formerly of Crosswater County, died Tuesday when a rock slide buried the crew he was supervising near Durango, Colorado. Whitmore, who had recently been promoted to construction foreman, was reportedly planning to marry his sweetheart and bring her west to join him. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Sarah had died waiting for a man who was already dead. James Whitmore had perished in an avalanche months before writing that letter to Owen, which meant someone else had written it. Someone who knew the whole story and wanted Owen to believe Sarah had died loving another man. Someone who wanted Owen to carry guilt that wasn't his to bear. Jane heard footsteps on the stairs and quickly stuffed the letters back into their hiding place. But her mind was racing, putting together a puzzle that painted Martha Briggs in an entirely different light. Martha entered the room without knocking, her face flushed with cold and righteous anger. "Are you ready? Mr. Kane is getting impatient, and that fire's moving faster than anyone expected." I found something interesting, Jane said carefully. Martha's eyes flicked to the desk, then back to Jane's face. Oh, what might that be? Letters from Sarah to her lover, the man she was planning to run away with. Martha's expression didn't change, but Jane caught something in her eyes, a flicker of calculation, of someone adjusting their story on the fly. Poor Sarah, Martha said softly. She was always weak when it came to handsome men with smooth tongues. Funny thing, though. Jane continued watching Martha's face carefully. I also found a letter from James Whitmore to Owen, written after the fire, confessing his love for Sarah, explaining why he wasn't there the night she died. Now Martha's composure cracked slightly. James wrote to Owen, except James Whitmore died in Colorado months before that letter was supposedly written. Avalanche. Made the papers. Jane stood slowly, her hand moving to the knife at her belt. Which means someone else wrote that letter. Someone who wanted Owen to think Sarah died loving another man. Martha's face went through a series of rapid changes, surprise calculation, then resignation. You're cleverer than you look. You wrote it. You wanted Owen to suffer. I wanted Owen to understand what he'd cost us. Martha's voice cracked with long-suppressed pain. Sarah was planning to leave him for a dead man because I couldn't bear to tell her the truth. She died believing in a fantasy, and Owen got to keep believing he was the wronged husband instead of the man who failed to see his wife's desperation. Jane felt a contraction building, but pushed through it. So you made him believe he was cursed? That everyone he loved died because of him? Better that than the truth that Sarah died trying to escape a marriage that was killing her soul, waiting for rescue that would never come. Because I was too much of a coward to shatter her illusions. The confession hung between them like smoke, years of lies and manipulation finally spoken aloud. But before Jane could respond, the sound of approaching flames grew suddenly louder, and Kane's voice carried up from the yard. The lady's time to make a decision. Fire's gonna be here in an hour, maybe less. Jane gripped the window frame as another contraction seized her stronger than before. The baby's coming. Martha's eyes widened. How close? Close. Too close to move safely. They stared at each other, two women who'd been enemies, now facing a crisis that demanded cooperation. Outside, the fire painted the horizon orange, and Kane's men were growing restless. I have to tell Owen the truth, Martha said finally. About Sarah, about the letters, about everything. Will it change anything? Martha looked at Jane's swollen belly, at the determination in her eyes, despite the pain. Maybe. Maybe it's time to stop letting the dead control the living. The wildfire reached the property line, just as Jane's labor began in earnest. She doubled over in the upstairs bedroom, gripping Owen's hands, as contractions came every few minutes. While below them, the sound of men's voices grew increasingly urgent. Fire's moving too fast, Kane shouted. We need to clear out now. The woman's in labor, Owen called back. She can't be moved. Through the window, Jane could see walls of flame racing across the prairie, driven by winds that howled like banshees. The air was thick with smoke, making it hard to breathe, and the temperature was rising dangerously. Owen, Martha said, appearing in the doorway, with her face streaked with soot. I need to tell you something about Sarah, about the night she died. Not now, Martha. Especially now. Martha's voice cut through his objection. Sarah wasn't planning to leave you for James Whitmore. She was planning to leave you for a dead man because I didn't have the courage to tell her James had been killed months earlier. Owen went very still, his hands tightening on Jane's. What? James died in an avalanche in Colorado. Sarah spent her last months writing love letters to a corpse because I let her believe he was still alive, still planning to rescue her from a marriage that maybe wasn't as happy as I wanted to believe. Jane cried out as another contraction seized her, the pain cutting through the tension in the room like a blade. When it passed, she found Owen staring at Martha with something approaching wonder. "The letter I got after the fire. I wrote it. Made you think she died loving another man because it was easier than admitting I'd failed her." Martha's voice broke. Easier than facing the fact that she died waiting for rescue that would never come. Outside, something exploded, probably the barn going up in flames. The house shook, windows rattled, and smoke began pouring under the doors in earnest. "Root cellar." Owen said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "It's our only chance." He scooped Jane up in his arms, just as another contraction hit her scream of pain, mixing with the roar of approaching flames. Martha grabbed blankets and medical supplies, her movements efficient despite her emotional turmoil. They made it to the kitchen as the front of the house caught fire flames licking through the windows and setting the curtains ablaze. The back door was their only escape route, leading to a yard already filling with smoke and burning debris. "Where's Kane?" Owen shouted over the roar of flames. "Gone," Martha replied. "Took his men and ran when the fire got too close." They stumbled across the yard through air so thick with smoke it was like breathing cotton. Jane's water broke as they reached the root cellar, the fluid mixing with sweat and soot in the hellish heat. Owen yanked open the heavy wooden door, and they tumbled into the stone-lined darkness just as the house's roof exploded in flames. The cellar was small, barely 8 feet square, but the walls were thick stone, and the ceiling was covered with 3 feet of earth. It would have to protect them from the inferno raging above. Martha lit a lamp with shaking hands, and by its flickering light, Jane could see the determination in her face as she prepared to deliver a baby in a hole in the ground while the world burned around them. "How far apart are the contractions?" Martha asked, her voice steady despite everything. 3 minutes, maybe less." Jane gasped and then doubled over as another wave of pain seized her. Owen knelt beside them, his face grim in the lamplight. "Martha, what you told me about Sarah?" "Why now?" "Because," Martha said, checking Jane's condition with competent hands, "I'm tired of letting lies destroy good people. Tired of using grief as an excuse for cruelty." Above them, the fire raged with terrifying intensity. They could hear timber crashing glass, exploding, the hungry roar of flames, consuming everything Owen had built. But down in the cellar, life was struggling to assert itself over destruction. Jane gripped Owen's hand as another contraction built, and in the grip of pain, the truth she'd carried for so long finally broke free. "Owen," she gasped, "there's something I need to tell you too." "Jane, save your strength." The word came out as almost a scream. You need to know about why I'm really afraid." Owen's face was intent in the lamplight, Martha's hands gentle as she worked. "What is it?" "I had a brother." Jane said the words tearing from her throat like pieces of her soul. "Tommy. He was 6 years old, and I was supposed to watch him while Mama was at work." Another contraction hit, but Jane fought through it, desperate to get the words out. "We went to the creek to catch minnows. The water was high from spring rains, but Tommy wanted to see the fish on the other side. I told him it was too dangerous, but he was just a little boy. He slipped and fell in." Owen's grip on her hand tightened. "Jane, I tried to save him." The words came out in a rush, years of guilt and self-hatred pouring out like blood from a wound. I grabbed his hand, held on as tight as I could, but the current was so strong, and I was only 9 years old and not strong enough, and... She broke off sobbing as another contraction seized her. When it passed, she looked up at Owen with eyes full of old pain and fresh terror. "He drowned because I wasn't strong enough to hold on. Mama never forgave me, never let me forget that it was my fault he died. And now I'm terrified that I'll fail this baby too. That I'll fail you the way I failed Tommy." The cellar fell silent, except for the muffled roar of flames above and Jane's ragged breathing. Owen stared at her for a long moment, then pulled her close, his voice rough with emotion. "Jane, you were 9 years old. A child trying to save another child. That wasn't your fault. But I let go. You held on as long as you could." Owen's voice was fierce with conviction. "And you've been punishing yourself ever since for something that was never your responsibility." Martha looked up from her preparations, her eyes soft with understanding. "Is that why you tried to run into the storm? Why you've been so afraid to let yourself love him?" Jane nodded, unable to speak around the lump in her throat. Another contraction built stronger than any before, and she felt the overwhelming urge to push. "The baby's coming," Martha said urgently. "Right now." Above them, something massive crashed, probably the house's main beam finally giving way. The cellar shook, dirt raining down from the ceiling, but the stone walls held firm. Jane bore down with everything she had, years of guilt and fear, channeled into the primal act of bringing life into the world. Owen held her hands, his face intense in the lamplight, while Martha guided their daughter into existence with steady competence. Rose Pike was born at midnight, her first cry piercing the underground darkness, just as the worst of the fire passed overhead. The baby was red and wrinkled and furious at being born into such circumstances, her tiny fists waving in protest at the smoky air that seeped even into their stone refuge. "She's perfect," Martha whispered, wrapping Rose in a clean blanket with hands that shook with emotion rather than fear. "Absolutely perfect." Jane took her daughter in her arms, feeling the solid weight of her, the miracle of her existence. Through the exhaustion and pain, she felt a joy so pure it seemed to light up the dark cellar. "Hello, Rose," she whispered. "You're safe now. You're loved." Owen leaned over them both, his finger tracing Rose's tiny cheek with infinite gentleness. "She's beautiful, Jane. She's absolutely beautiful." Above them, the fire began to subside as it ran out of fuel. They could still hear the crackle of flames, but the terrible roar was fading. Slowly, carefully, Owen climbed the wooden ladder and cracked open the cellar door. Dawn was breaking over a blackened landscape, smoke still rising from the ruins of everything he'd built. The house was gone, nothing left but charred timbers and smoking ash. The barn was destroyed, the chicken coop reduced to charcoal, every structure on the property consumed by the flames. But they were alive. All of them were alive. Jane emerged from the cellar with Rose in her arms, blinking in the pale sunlight. The destruction was complete, but somehow liberating. The past was literally ashes, now swept clean by fire and ready for something new to grow. What now? Martha asked, standing in the ruins of everything she'd worked to destroy, her expensive dress, ruined, but her face oddly peaceful. "Now we rebuild," Owen said simply, his arm around Jane's shoulders. "All of us. Together." Within hours, wagons began arriving from town. Word of the fire had spread quickly, and with it news of what had really happened, Martha's confession to several neighbors before the flames struck Crawford's cowardly flight, with Kane's hired guns, the truth about Owen's innocence in his wife's death. Dr. Hendricks examined Jane and Rose in the back of his medical wagon, pronouncing both healthy despite their ordeal. Mrs. Patterson brought clean clothes and soft blankets. Even some of the men who'd ridden out with torches in righteous anger came with lumber and willing hands. Hutchins approached Owen with genuine remorse written across his weathered face. "Heard what really happened. About Martha's lies, about Crawford's arrangement with those gunfighters. What I did selling that girl like she was livestock." He shook his head, unable to finish. "You're Hutchins," Owen said quietly. "A man can't change his past, but he can choose what he does with his future. I want to make it right somehow, all of it. Then help us build something better, for all of us." The rebuilding began immediately, but it was more than just wood and nails. The community that had been poisoned by lies and fear was slowly healing itself one honest conversation at a time. Jane sat in the shade of a borrowed wagon, nursing Rose and watching neighbors work together who hadn't spoken civilly in years. Martha labored alongside the others, her hands willing despite her age, her presence a kind of living apology. "She's strong," Martha said, approaching Jane during a break in the work. "Takes after her mother. She takes after herself," Jane replied firmly but kindly. "She's her own person, not an echo of anyone else's story." Martha nodded, understanding passing between them. She hesitated, then spoke again. "Jane, there's something else you should know. About Crawford and his legal petition." Jane looked up sharply. "What about it?" "It was all fraudulent. The signatures the court order Crawford forged, most of it with Kane's help. They planned to take you somewhere remote then." Martha's voice trailed off, but her meaning was clear. "And you knew this?" Martha's face crumpled with shame. "Not at first. I hired Kane to intimidate Owen to make him give you up voluntarily. But when I realized what Crawford really intended, what they were really planning..." She shook her head. "That's when I knew I'd gone too far. That's why I told you the truth about Sarah." Jane processed this revelation, understanding now just how close she'd come to a fate far worse than anything her mother had sold her into. What happened to them? "Crawford's dead. Shot in a cantina in Mexico, according to the marshal who came looking for him. Kane and his men scattered to the wind." Martha met Jane's eyes steadily. "There's going to be an investigation into Crawford's activities, into my part in hiring those men. I may face charges." "Good," Jane said without hesitation. "Actions should have consequences." Martha nodded, accepting the judgment. "I deserve whatever comes. I wanted you to know that not everyone who wronged you will escape justice." As the weeks passed, the new house rose on the same foundation as the old, but different in every way that mattered. Larger windows let in more light. A wider porch welcomed visitors. Gardens were planned for spaces where once only regret had grown. The investigation into Crawford's corruption expanded beyond just his treatment of Jane and Owen. Other irregularities came to light: bribes, taken evidence, destroyed innocent people, railroaded through a legal system he'd perverted for personal gain. Martha's cooperation with the authorities, combined with her age and obvious remorse, earned her a suspended sentence and community service. But her reputation never recovered. She sold her remaining property and moved to a small room above the general store in town, living quietly and simply. But she visited the Pike Ranch regularly, bringing small gifts for Rose and careful friendship for Jane. The transformation wasn't easy. Decades of bitterness couldn't be undone overnight. But she was genuinely trying to build something positive from the wreckage of her old hatred. 1 year later, Jane stood in the kitchen of her rebuilt home, her hands resting on her newly rounded belly, their second child conceived in love rather than desperation. Through the window, she watched Owen teaching Rose to walk in the yard, his patient hands guiding her uncertain steps. Rose had grown into a determined, fearless child who approached the world with curiosity rather than caution. She babbled constantly in a language only she understood, laughed at everything, and had never known a moment's hunger or fear or shame. Watching her, Jane felt the deepest satisfaction of her life. The promise kept the cycle broken. "Mama, mama." Rose called, pointing at a butterfly that had landed on Owen's hat. She still couldn't say his name clearly, but her meaning was always obvious. Owen scooped her up, spinning her around until she shrieked with laughter. The sound carried across the rebuilt ranch like music, like prayer, like the sound of a family that had been forged in fire and tempered by love. Martha appeared in the doorway, her arms full of the weekly supplies she'd taken to bringing from town. Her face was lined with new wrinkles, but her eyes held a peace that had been absent for years. "How are you feeling?" she asked Jane, noting the way she held her back, the tired set of her shoulders. Like I'm about to have another baby, Jane replied with a smile. Dr. Hendricks says any day now. A boy or girl, do you think? Healthy, Jane said simply. That's all that matters. They worked together in comfortable silence, preparing the evening meal while Owen played with Rose in the yard. It was a scene of domestic tranquility that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier, but healing had a way of growing in the strangest places. After dinner, when Rose was asleep and Martha had returned to town, Jane and Owen sat on their new porch watching the stars emerge in the clear Texas sky. The night was warm for December, with just enough breeze to remind them that seasons changed, that nothing stayed the same forever. Do you think we'll make it? Jane asked, her hand resting on her belly where their son, she was certain it was a son, practiced his nighttime acrobatics. Make it how? Through all the ordinary days. Through illness and arguments and the 1,000 small disappointments that wear couples down. Through everything that comes after the dramatic part is over. Owen considered this, his arm tightening around her shoulders. I think we've got a better chance than most. We've seen each other at our worst, and we're still here. We've seen each other through fire, literally and figuratively. And we chose each other anyway. Owen turned to face her in the starlight. That has to count for something. Jane leaned into his warmth, feeling the baby kick against her ribs as if in agreement. Around them, the night settled into its familiar rhythms and the distant call of coyotes, the whisper of wind through grass, the soft sounds of a ranch at rest. But beneath the peace, Jane could feel the tension that would always be part of their lives. Not everyone in the county had fully accepted their story or their right to happiness. There were still whispers, still sideways glances, still the occasional rider who passed their property with hard eyes and harder thoughts. Some battles, Jane had learned, were never completely won. But they could be fought to a standstill, held at bay by love and determination and the stubborn refusal to let hatred triumph. Whatever comes, she said quietly, we face it together. Together, Owen agreed, sealing the promise with a kiss that tasted of coffee and hope and the particular sweetness of love that had been tested by flame. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggles and human triumphs alike. But down on earth, in a house rebuilt from ashes and dreams, 2 people who had been broken by the world had found each other and made themselves whole. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There would be more challenges, more heartbreak, more battles to fight. Rose would grow up knowing she was wanted and loved, but she would also know that the world could be cruel, and that strength came from facing that cruelty with courage and compassion. Their son would be born into a family that understood both the cost of hatred and the power of forgiveness. Jane pressed her hand to her belly, feeling her child respond to her touch, and smiled in the darkness. She'd finally learned the difference between being owned and being loved, between surviving and truly living. The guilt over Tommy's death would always be part of her, but it no longer defined her. She'd found something stronger than guilt, more powerful than fear. The past was ashes scattered by wind and time. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain, but no longer frightening. And in the space between what was lost and what was yet to come, Jane McAllister Pike had found something she'd never dared hope for. A home, a love, and a family that no amount of money could buy or hate could destroy. Tomorrow would bring Fire Day again, the annual remembrance that had once been used as a weapon against them. But this year, it would be different. This year they would light their own flames, not of destruction, but of remembrance for all they'd lost, and gratitude for all they'd found. The roses would bloom in spring, planted over the graves of old sorrows. The children would grow strong and free, knowing they were wanted and cherished. And somewhere in the vast Texas sky, the stars bore witness to the simple miracle of 2 broken souls who had found healing in each other's arms. It was enough. It was everything. It was home.